I am excited to be celebrating so many things all at once. And with the Reconciling Ministries, I want to share a little bit about some of the work that God has for us to do. Some of you received, as you came in this morning, a brochure that talks about us being a reconciling congregation. That brochure, I think, is lovely. It was created in 2019. And if you read through it, it sounds very much like a statement. It is a statement. This is who we are. It's not a movement. It's not a this is who we're becoming. And it doesn't say what specific kinds of things we need to do. And part of figuring that out is this process of looking at who we are, where our community is, what is the move that we are to make next. And that's why the theme for Reconciling Ministries this year is your movement, your move. In the beginning, God moved over the waters of the deep, and there was a movement called creation that began and is still ongoing. It's often said Rome wasn't built in a day. Our biblical creation story says something similar in saying it took even God, the supreme creator of the universe, 7 days. And for those of us who look at that from a poetic standpoint, 7 days is like a really long time. Last Sunday, we sang about morning has broken, like the very first morning. Blackbird has spoken like the first bird. Praise for the singing, praise for the morning, praise for them springing fresh from the word. We talked about God's recreation of every day as a new day. Now, I don't know about you, but me, in the morning, I'm often outside with my dog, and lately the recreation of the new day has not sounded like blackbirds, it sounded more like Canada geese. And they're not nearly as melodious, but in their own way, they have a very distinctive call. They know in their DNA somehow that God has called them to go south, and they are willing to tell everyone about it. In the similar way, on milkweed recently, I've seen a butterfly and marveled at its beauty. I wondered if it was one of the ones that was of that monarch tribe that takes part in the Great Migration. You know about that movement, right? It's really amazing. Covers something like 2,500 miles from the United States and Canada, where they are in the summertime, where it's lovely in the summertime, all the way down to the forests of central Mexico, where they hibernate in the wintertime. Again, it's in their DNA, this call, this place where they're supposed to go, what they're supposed to be. And our Christianity claims that there is a call on our lives as well, and a song that we are to sing, as Miss Debbie said, to point it all in one direction. And as we engage in this process of figuring out what one direction is it that we are to go as a community of faith here in Lansing, part of what we have to do is figure out who are we as individuals and where does all that come together. How is this call to reconciliation with one another, with God, with our community, with our world, our call to be ambassadors for Christ in this time and place? So as we continue to meditate on that together, will you join me once again in prayer? May the words of my mouth and the thoughts and meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God. For you are our rock and our Redeemer. You are the one who created us, who gives us a call on our lives to serve, to be reconciled to you, to be reconciled with one another, and to be ambassadors of that reconciliation in the world. Amen. I want to share with you a gallop through the Bible. As Christians, the Bible is our history. And in the same way as we can take billions of years of creation and consolidate it into just 7 days, I'm going to take 66 books and consolidate it into about 3 minutes. Are you ready? Okay. So in the beginning, God moved over the waters of the deep, and there was a movement called creation. In biblical history, the story as people of faith in the Old and New Testament began with water. It continues in what some have called a third testament in our lives. Perhaps you've heard it said, your life will be the only testament that some people read. That's why Miss Debbie and I believe God want us to get that megaphone pointed in the right direction, telling people about God's love. In the Old Testament book of Genesis, a man named Abram moved from his home. He left everything he knew and set out to journey to a new place that God had called him. And in the movement of Abram and Sarai, who became Abraham and Sarah, there was a movement towards God's covenant for all people, not just people in one place, but people in all places. The story of God's people is a really long one. The Old Testament is full of stories of journey, stories of forgetting and needing to be reminded again what kind of lives God calls us to live. When the Hebrew people were slaves in Egypt, 2 Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, heard God's call to life, and they saved at least one, probably more, of the Hebrew babies in defiance of Pharaoh's orders to throw the baby boys into the Nile River. The baby Moses was saved on a little ark that his mother made, and although he had an anger problem as a youth and wasn't really keen on claiming his calling at first, in his adulthood, Moses led the Hebrews away from oppression through the parted waters of the Red Sea, and there was a movement toward God's justice and mercy. In another Old Testament story, a young girl named Esther, who, though she was orphaned, moved from obscurity to the role of queen, creating a movement toward salvation for all of her people. Many of the Old Testament prophets moved the people toward faithfulness, and there was movement towards righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And in the fullness of time, God sent an angel, Gabriel, to speak to a young girl named Mary. And Mary moved somehow from much perplexed to committed to serve the Lord. And in the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, there was a movement toward a world forever changed. Jesus healed the sick, fed the hungry, ate with sinners, and in doing so, Jesus moved the boundary lines for who was included in God's family. And Jesus moved toward the cross, and there was a movement toward the true meaning of love, of giving of oneself for the sake of others. God moves us toward transformed life. May our movement transform the world. I hope that as we took that gallop through the Bible, you were thinking of many other stories, for there are so many. I hope that you're also seeing places where it connects with your story, for that is our next process, to connect God's story and our story, and to be able to tell that story to the rest of the world. May it be so among us. Amen.